Hey, and welcome back to Resilience Automotive Performance. Today, I'm going to be showing you guys how to pack your wheel bearings. So I'm currently in the middle of replacing the wheel bearings on my Project Conquest, as well as installing the new suspension and big brake kit. But before I can get to any of that, I've got to finish up these wheel bearings. So what you're currently seeing is the outer wheel bearing. This is a Timken unit, and as you can see, it has already been packed with grease. But I still have the large end, or the inner wheel bearing, to finish up, which is the bearing that I'm going to be showing you guys here shortly. So here is the inner wheel bearing, and what I've been just calling the big end. When you get into your wheel hubs, you're going to notice there's typically a smaller and a larger, and it's mainly just due to the size of the spindle. So we need to pack grease into this wheel bearing, one, to service it well and to make sure it's going to last a long time, as well as clean it. So this is a conical roller bearing, and it is going to mate up with the outer race that's already been pressed into the wheel hub. Now we are going to force grease all in between and out and around the wheel bearing. Now I like to start on the more open end of the bearing, and what you're going to be seeing me do with the grease is I'm going to put a large amount of grease right in the palm of my hand, and I'm going to scoop / press the grease right in between the inner race and the bearing cage. So I got these bearings. One, the smaller end, is by Timken, and this is a national bearing. One thing to keep in mind if you're doing this on your project is you may have some type of oil seal or bearing grease seal that will help protect it against dust. Here is the original oil seal I pulled off of our Project Conquest, part number 494122. So you're going to want to remember to replace these as well when you are doing your wheel bearings. Here's the grease I like to use. This is just some Lucas Oil Red and Tacky. I ended up finding that I really enjoyed this stuff mainly because I watched Project Farm and it performed excellently in comparison to even just the base level Lucas Oil, as well as other products. So most wheel bearings are going to come in a protective film or grease. We aren't going to need that, and we don't want that mixing up with the new grease that we're going to apply to our wheel bearing. So what we're going to do is just give it a quick clean using some clean rag and spraying it down with some brake clean. And we don't need to go crazy ham on this. We just want to get a large amount of that protective film or grease off of the wheel bearing, make sure it's clean and prepped for when we pack the wheel bearing with the new grease. Alright, so this is just to show you guys that it's cleaned up, give you a rough idea of the grease that comes pre-packaged with. Definitely going to want to clean this up. As you can see, if you look at the previous frames and just from what I had picked up from the bearing itself, these things have that protective layer, but it's also quite dirty. I'm wondering if it's like a mixture of graphite or something. You can even see there's still a little bit left in there, but I can just take my rag, try to clean it up. I'm not trying to leave any of this rag or linen or whatever you use in the bearing race though. It's just meant to get it nice and cleaned and prepped for the new grease. So as you can see, I have a sizable amount of the red and tacky grease. We're going to begin to start pushing it and packing the bearing. Now if you have too much, it's not all that big of an issue. Just use whatever is left in your hand. We can either prep the spindle or pack the inner portion of the wheel hub with some more grease. Or save it if you haven't done the outer bearing, just use that for the next bearing that you're going to pack. So now what I'm going to begin to do, like I said earlier, using the larger end of the bearing race, going to pack it into there, and I'm going to keep packing it until I see it squeeze out the smaller end. If you haven't noticed already, I'm using nylon gloves because this thing is messy. Alright, so what you'll see is as you're pushing it, it'll like to build up right there in the center. Just recycle it. Oh man. But this is what you're going to begin to see. Come on. So this is what you're going to begin to see, is that grease is being packed in between the bearings, and it's going to press out onto the other side of the race. And we're going to do this all the way around. So if you get a little lost in the sauce like I have, what you can do is run along the bearing race and to make sure that that grease has been applied evenly across each of the bearings, to kind of get an idea too, if you get lost, if it gets a little messy, of which bearings have and haven't yet really been packed. So in my case, I'm getting near the end, and you can tell just by looking into the bearing race that it's just about evenly packed all the way across. And so now I can just take the extra grease that I had and start applying it to the portions of the bearing that are going to go up against the race. Then if you have any doubts, flip it over, use some of that leftover grease, and just start going right along the small end, the smaller face, and you can test it that way. And you can make sure that the grease is being packed going back through the big end by pressing it through the small end. All right, so I have all this leftover grease. Now the nice thing is I can just apply this to the outer race face, as well as just use any of the extra stuff to pack the center of the wheel hub to have some extra relief grease. All right, as you can see, this stuff totally makes a mess, so be prepared for that. The nylon gloves are coming in handy. Now, what I'm going to be doing next, and I've heard multiple different opinions on this. I've heard some folks say putting nothing into the center of the hub is the adequate way to go, as it will reduce the overall friction and heat being generated, and the grease really isn't going to move from the center of the hub into the races and into the bearing itself. I've also heard just pack that sucker as much as you'd like. I'm going to go the safe route and actually put grease into the center portion of the wheel hub, just to account for if there's any hot spots or there is grease being lost in the inner and outer wheel bearing, that hopes that that grease would move and start to replenish this. Last thing we have to do is put that oil seal in to keep that grease within the wheel bearing and the wheel hub. So helpful tip, if you don't have some way to ultimately get the O-ring pressed on, or you're going to be lightly tapping it like I am with a dead blow hammer, you can use the old bearing race to lay concentrically on top of the new oil seal and tap it down into place to make sure it's fully seated. Alright, so here is the oil seal. I'm going to prep it by lubricating the inner portion of the seal, as well as you can probably lightly pack around this portion of the O-ring. What I don't want to do when I'm going to be cleaning up is this outer edge, and try to clean up that where this outer edge of the seal is going to connect and be pressed into the wheel hub. And I'm just going to be using a small dead blow hammer to slowly tap and press this onto the wheel hub. Here is my trusty oil seal applicator. So here is the new oil seal and the inner bearing installed. There is a small gap, and all that is that you're seeing between there is the difference between where the outer race sits, the wheel bearing itself sits, and then this has just been tapped down lightly onto the next ledge that holds this oil seal in place. And what you'll notice on the old seals is these little lips of the oil seal are pressed out and are no longer reusable, because they have been used and held, and they just keep the grease and pressure on the spindle so there's no grease coming out. So here is the spindle of our Chrysler Conquest, and as you can see, I have prepared the spindle's shaft. Yep, I used that word. All the 14-year-old boys are laughing. And so once the wheel bearing is on, this is going to help guide and slide it on right into place. This is where that oil seal is going to ultimately mount onto and not allow any grease to be ejecting onto the face of the spindle. Alright, last but not least, here you can see the hub is installed and is now supporting the Willwood brake kit for this Project Conquest. Thank you guys so much for watching, and if you want to see more content like this, please like and subscribe and comment down below if you've got any questions, and follow our Project Conquest build that we currently have up in the playlists included at the end screen. Thanks.